The first thing I noticed when I stepped out of my truck was how quiet it was. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. It was late afternoon, maybe 4:30 or so, and the air smelled thick with pine and damp earth. The forest stretched in every direction, an endless sea of trees, dark and still. I was miles away from the nearest town, up in the mountains, camping alone. I had picked this spot carefully. It was off a Forest Service road that didn't see much traffic, and I had parked my truck a good ways back from where I planned to set up camp, hidden from any passersby. I wanted isolation. No campsites, no picnic tables, no fire rings, just raw wilderness. I'd done trips like this before, but something about this place felt different. Maybe it was just the eerie silence, or maybe it was the way the trees seemed taller, denser. It was a little unsettling, but I pushed that thought away. I shouldered my pack and started hiking into the woods, stepping over fallen logs, crunching leaves and twigs under my boots. My plan was to go about a mile in, set up camp near a small creek I had spotted on the map. Water sources were always good, and they made a nice backdrop for sleeping. The hike was uneventful, but that feeling, that strange, quiet weight, never left me. It felt like the forest was watching, like something was just out of sight. I chalked it up to being alone in the deep woods. Your mind plays tricks when there's no one around to ground you. I found the creek easily, a thin ribbon of water winding through the trees. It was perfect. I set my pack down and started making camp. The routine helped ease the unease, clearing a flat spot, setting up the tent, gathering firewood. The work kept me busy. I built a small fire as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. By the time I sat down to eat, the first stars were flickering overhead. The night air was crisp, colder than I expected. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and sat by the fire, listening to the faint trickle of the creek. No birds, no rustling in the brush, just the fire popping and the water flowing. I should have been relaxed. Instead, I felt on edge. I told myself it was just my imagination. The wilderness can feel unnatural when you're truly alone. I finished my food, banked the fire, and crawled into my tent. It was a good tent, sturdy for season, meant for rough conditions. I zipped myself in, laying on my sleeping bag, listening. The forest remained still. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember was waking up suddenly. No sound had woken me, just a feeling. The air inside the tent felt thick, oppressive, like something had changed. I held my breath, listening. Then soft, slow footsteps outside. They weren't heavy, not an animal crashing through the brush. They were deliberate, careful, human. I froze, every muscle locked. My mind raced. Who else would be out here? I hadn't seen another car, another hiker. And why would they be sneaking around my campsite in the dead of night? The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would give me away. I had my knife within reach, but what good would that do? The canvas of the tent was thin. Whoever was out there could slice it open before I even had time to react. Minutes passed, maybe longer, couldn't tell. Then, just as slowly as they had come, the footsteps retreated, fading into the woods. I stayed completely still, waiting, straining to hear any other sound. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won out. I don't remember falling back asleep, but I must have. When I woke again, it was early morning. Sunlight filtered through the trees, making the forest seem almost normal again. Almost. I stepped outside the tent, scanning the ground. Footprints. They circled my tent, deliberate and slow. They weren't boot prints. They were bare feet. My stomach turned. I had camped in remote places before. I had encountered strange things. But this was something different, something wrong. I packed up fast. I didn't even bother eating. I just shoved everything into my pack, doused the fire pit with creek water, and started hiking back toward my truck. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, scanning the trees. Halfway back, I found more footprints. Not just a few dozens, all barefoot, some smaller, some larger, and they were fresh. I moved faster. By the time I reached my truck, my pulse was pounding. The dirt around my vehicle was disturbed. More footprints. I unlocked the doors, tossed my gear inside, and got in, locking them immediately. The engine roared to life and I threw it into reverse, tires spinning on the dirt road. I didn't look back. I drove straight back to town, stopping at a gas station just off the highway. I got out, stretched my legs, tried to shake the feeling that I was still being watched. When I glanced at my truck, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A single, smeared handprint on the back window. Too large to be a child's, too small to be a man's. I never went back to that forest, and I never camp alone anymore. I had spent most of my life camping, hiking, and being alone in the wilderness. The woods had always been my refuge, a place to escape the world, clear my head, and push my limits. It was something I had done so many times before that I never thought twice about the risks. I should have. That fall, I had planned a solo camping trip in a stretch of forest that saw little traffic. Cold Creek ran through the valley, and the area was known for its remote beauty. It was rough country, miles away from any town, and I liked it that way. I had everything I needed: my pack, my tent, my knife, a good supply of food, and a weathered old map showing the trails and a few abandoned logging roads. The hike in was long but uneventful. I had started early in the morning, moving at a steady pace through the trees, listening to the sounds of the wind rustling through the branches. The air had the sharp bite of approaching winter, and by mid-afternoon, I had reached the spot I had chosen. An old clearing near the creek, nestled between the trees, far from any marked trail. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent on dry, level ground and gathering enough firewood to last the night. As the sun dipped below the treeline, I sat by the fire, eating my dinner and enjoying the solitude. The only sounds were the distant rush of the creek and the occasional call of an owl. Felt peaceful. I remember thinking how perfect the night was. Clear sky, no wind, just the steady crackle of the fire. Then I heard it, a noise from the woods, just beyond the firelight. A rustling, faint but deliberate. I froze, straining my ears, my heart already beating faster. It could have been anything, an animal, the wind, but something about it put me on edge. I slowly reached for my flashlight and shone it toward the trees. Nothing, just darkness and shadows stretching between the trunks. Still, I felt that creeping unease, that instinctive warning that something wasn't right. I told myself it was nothing, but I kept the fire high and my knife close as I settled into my tent for the night. Sleep didn't come easily. The ground was cold, and every little noise outside sent my mind racing. I tried to brush it off as nerves, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Something was out there, watching. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up to the distinct sound of footsteps. Not the soft, shuffling kind made by an animal, but deliberate, careful steps on dry leaves. Human. I held my breath, my body stiff with fear. The sound stopped, and for a long moment, there was only silence. I reached for my knife, gripping it so tightly my knuckles ached. My heart pounded in my chest, so loud I was sure it would give me away. Then the sound started again, closer this time. A slow, measured pace, circling just outside my tent. I lay there, frozen, every muscle locked in place. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to be stealthy. They wanted me to know they were there. I thought about calling out, but what would I say? What if they didn't answer? Or worse, what if they did? Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps retreated, fading back into the forest. I waited, straining to hear anything over the pounding in my ears, but the woods had gone silent again. I didn't sleep after that. I lay awake, gripping my knife, staring at the thin fabric of the tent, listening for any sign of movement. I wanted to believe it was just some hiker passing through, but that didn't make sense. No one would be out here at this hour, miles from the nearest trail. And if they were lost, why hadn't they called out for help? Dawn couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I crawled out of the tent, scanning the woods around me. Nothing seemed out of place, but then I saw them. Footprints, clear, fresh prints in the dirt, circling my tent in a slow, deliberate path. A cold wave of fear rolled through me. Someone had been watching me, standing just outside, close enough to hear me breathe. I packed up fast, shoving my gear into my pack with shaking hands. I didn't eat, didn't stop to rest. I just hiked, moving fast, my eyes darting to every shadow, every tree. I didn't see anyone, but I felt them. I could sense them, just beyond the trees, out of sight but never far away. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, throwing my pack into the back and locking the doors the second I climbed inside. I drove without looking back. The image of those footprints burned into my mind. I never went back to Cold Creek, and I never camp alone anymore. I don't know exactly when I realized I was being watched. It wasn't all at once. It was like a slow creeping feeling, the kind that sneaks up on you when you're alone in the woods, when the sounds shift just a little and the trees feel like they're pressing in closer than before. I was camping alone in a remote part of a national forest, miles from the nearest road, far from any trailhead. The plan was to spend 3 nights out there, testing myself, pushing my limits, living off what I carried and what I could find. I had everything I needed: food, water filtration, a solid tent, and a reliable pack. I wasn't new to this. I'd done trips like this before. I knew how to be careful. I knew how to stay safe. But knowing something and feeling something are 2 different things. The first night, everything seemed normal. I set up my tent in a small clearing, cooked a quick meal over my stove, and settled in as the sun dropped behind the treetops. The sounds of the forest carried on around me. Crickets, frogs, the occasional rustling in the underbrush as some small animal moved through. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet you don't get in the world outside the woods. Sometime around midnight, I woke up. No reason, just awake. The fire had burned down to embers. My tent was sealed tight, and outside, the night was still. Too still. I listened for a long time, staring up at the ceiling of my tent, waiting to hear something, anything. But there was nothing. No crickets, no rustling, no wind moving through the branches. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes you hold your breath without thinking about it. Then, from somewhere in the dark, a twig snapped. Not close, but not far either. Maybe 30 yards away. It wasn't just some random branch falling. It was deliberate, the sound of something or someone stepping where they shouldn't be. I stayed still, heart pounding, ears straining for any other sound. But there was nothing. Just that one snap, then silence. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer moving through the brush. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. Deer don't move like that. They step carefully, their movements light. This was heavier. This was something else. I stayed awake for another hour, listening, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted back to sleep, uneasy but too tired to fight it. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and took a slow look around. Nothing seemed out of place. No tracks, no signs of anything having come through. But that didn't mean much. The forest floor was thick with pine needles, soft enough to swallow footprints. I shook it off, ate a quick breakfast, and packed up for the day. I had planned to hike out a few miles, do some exploring, then loop back before sunset. As I moved through the trees, the feeling from the night before stuck with me, a nagging weight in the back of my mind. By mid-afternoon, I found something that made my stomach drop. A footprint. Not mine. Not an animal's. A human footprint, half sunk into the damp earth near a creek bed. It was fresh. The edges were sharp, the dirt around it still slightly wet. And it was big. Bigger than my own foot, and I wear a size 11. I stared at it for a long time, my brain scrambling for some reasonable explanation. Maybe it was an old track, softened by the weather. Maybe it was a trick of the light. But no, I knew what I was looking at, and it was fresh. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, my pulse hammering in my ears. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't want to head straight back to camp. If someone was out here, I didn't want to lead them right to where I was staying. So I kept moving, circling wide, taking a different route than I had planned, keeping my eyes open for any other tracks, any other signs of someone being out here. I didn't find anything else, but that didn't make me feel any better. By the time I made it back to camp, the sun was sinking low, the sky burning orange and pink through the trees. I forced myself to go through my usual routine, set up my fire, cook my dinner, check my gear, but my nerves were shot. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow felt like something watching me. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in my tent, staring at the darkness, listening. And at some point, late in the night, I heard it again. A step, closer this time, maybe 20 yards away. Then another, and another. Slow, deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. My body went rigid. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. I waited, heart hammering so hard I thought whoever, or whatever, was out there would hear it. Then, from just outside my tent, maybe 5 feet away, came the sound of breathing. Deep, slow, not an animal, person. I clenched my knife in my hand, my fingers aching from how tight I gripped it. I didn't move, couldn't. If I made a sound, if I did anything, I didn't know what would happen. The breathing stayed there for what felt like forever. Then slowly, quietly, it moved away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I didn't move until the first light of dawn seeped through the trees. When I finally unzipped my tent, the clearing was empty. But there, in the dirt just outside the entrance, was a single footprint, bigger than mine. I packed up and left. I didn't eat. I didn't stop. I moved fast, pushing through the miles as quickly as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't listen. By the time I reached my car, the sun was high, the world feeling normal again, safe again. But I knew the truth. I wasn't alone out there. Someone had been watching me, and whoever it was, they were close enough to hear me breathe. I spent most of my life outdoors. Camping, hiking, fishing, I've done it all. I know how to handle myself in the wild, how to prepare, how to stay safe. But no amount of experience could have prepared me for the night I spent alone in the mountains. An experience so terrifying that it still haunts me to this day. There were no ghosts, no monsters, nothing supernatural. Just the overwhelming weight of fear, the gut-wrenching feeling of being completely and utterly alone with something or someone out there. It was late summer when I set out on a solo camping trip deep in the remote forests of Montana. I had chosen an area well off the beaten path, a place where few people ventured. I wanted solitude, the kind of isolation where the only sounds were the rustling of trees and the occasional call of a distant bird. I parked my truck on a narrow dirt road, shouldered my heavy pack, and started hiking. The trail, if you could call it that, was barely visible. Overgrown brush scraped against my legs as I pushed forward, deeper and deeper into the wilderness. After several hours of hiking, I found a clearing near a small creek. It was perfect, flat ground, plenty of firewood, and fresh water nearby. The sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows across the forest floor, so I wasted no time setting up camp. I pitched my tent near the treeline, built a small fire, and cooked a simple meal. By the time I finished eating, darkness had settled in. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the trees. I sat on a log, enjoying the quiet, feeling completely at ease. But that peace wouldn't last. The first signs, it started with small things that didn't seem too concerning at first. As I was cleaning up my campsite, I heard a rustling noise in the brush about 20 feet away. I froze, listening carefully. Probably just a deer, I told myself. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it in the direction of the noise. Nothing. The undergrowth was thick, but I saw no movement, no reflection of eyes staring back at me. I shrugged it off and went back to my fire. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, it was closer. I stood up slowly, my flashlight in hand. I scanned the darkness beyond the fire's reach, straining my ears. Still nothing. The forest was eerily quiet now. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the faint sound of the fire popping. Something felt wrong. I wasn't new to the woods. I had been in the presence of predators before. Bears, mountain lions, even wolves. But this felt different. This wasn't the silence of an animal stalking its prey. It was something else. Tension builds. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped the flap shut. I laid there for a long time, listening, waiting. Then I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps moving around the perimeter of my campsite. I held my breath, my heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't an animal. The footsteps were too controlled, too precise. They circled my tent slowly, methodically. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was unbearable. I strained my ears, trying to hear anything. Breathing, movement, anything at all. Nothing. Minutes passed. I didn't move, barely dared to breathe. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting my mind play tricks on me. Then something brushed against my tent. A slow, deliberate drag of fingers or claws across the fabric. My blood turned to ice. A long night. I stayed completely still, every muscle in my body tense. My knife was clutched so tightly that my hand ached. I listened, waiting for something, anything to happen, but there was only silence. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I must have drifted off, though it was the lightest sleep I had ever experienced. A loud snap jolted me awake. It was still dark, but the faintest hint of dawn was beginning to creep through the trees. Something had stepped on a branch near my tent. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just listened. Another step, closer this time, then silence. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, until finally, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. Only then did I slowly unzip my tent and peer outside. There were footprints, human footprints. They circled my tent multiple times, stopping just inches from where my head had been as I slept. The escape. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, my hands shaking. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. I left everything I didn't need behind, my firewood, my food, even my extra clothes. I just needed to get out. The hike back to my truck was the longest, most nerve-wracking trek of my life. I moved quickly, my heart pounding, every snap of a twig sending a fresh wave of terror through me. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and locked the doors. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. Then, as I turned the key in the ignition, I noticed something in the dirt just outside my driver's side window. More footprints, fresh ones, leading directly to my truck. Conclusion: I never went back to that area again. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me that night. I told myself it was just some local messing with me, maybe a hunter who had stumbled across my camp. But deep down, I know that's not true, because whoever it was, they didn't just happen to find my camp. They had been following me the entire time. I had planned this trip for months, an isolated solo camping trip deep in the backcountry of Montana. No cell service, no people, just me, my gear, and the wilderness. It was exactly what I wanted. The last few weeks had been stressful, and I needed to clear my head. I'd done countless solo trips before, so I wasn't worried. I packed enough supplies for 5 days, checked my maps, and set off early in the morning. The first day went smoothly. The weather was perfect, crisp morning air, bright blue skies, and a gentle breeze rustling through the pine trees. I hiked nearly 12 miles into the backcountry, deep enough that I was sure I wouldn't see another person. As the sun dipped low, I found a good spot near a small stream, pitched my tent, and cooked a simple meal. The solitude was comforting. The second day, I woke early and decided to push deeper. I followed a narrow game trail through thick trees, occasionally checking my GPS. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon a clearing with a small, stagnant pond in the center. It looked undisturbed, the kind of place that rarely saw human footsteps. Something about it made me uneasy. Maybe the silence, maybe the way the trees seemed to lean inward, but I ignored the feeling and moved on. The terrain grew rougher, the undergrowth denser. I had to push branches out of the way and step carefully over exposed roots. The farther I hiked, the more I noticed the silence. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my boots crunching the earth. I stopped to take a sip of water and listened. Nothing. Complete, suffocating silence. I had spent enough time in the wilderness to know that was unusual. Even when predators were around, the silence never lasted this long. Something was off. I shook it off and kept moving. By mid-afternoon, I found a solid camping spot on a slight incline, giving me a clear view of the forest below. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and ate. As the sky darkened, the uneasy feeling from earlier returned. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but an awareness, like I was being watched. I scanned the tree line, but saw nothing. The first odd thing happened that night. I woke suddenly, unsure why. My fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was still eerily quiet. Then I heard it, a single, deliberate step just outside my tent. My breath caught. I strained to listen. Another step. I reached for my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. I swept the beam in a wide arc. Nothing. The forest was still. I waited, heart pounding, before finally convincing myself it was an animal and settling back into my sleeping bag. But sleep didn't come easily. The next day, I packed up and moved again, trying to shake the unsettling feeling. I hiked for hours, pushing deeper into the forest. The silence followed me. By late afternoon, I found another clearing and set up camp. I forced myself to eat, but I wasn't hungry. My stomach was knotted, my nerves frayed. The feeling of being watched hadn't left me. That night, it got worse. I woke up to the sound of my camp stove being knocked over. My pulse slammed against my ribs. I sat up, gripping my knife, and listened. A faint rustling, slow and deliberate. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The moon cast long shadows through the trees, but I saw nothing. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, listening, watching. The rustling stopped, but I didn't sleep after that. Morning couldn't come fast enough. I packed up and started hiking back the way I came. I'd had enough. I moved quickly, keeping my head on a swivel. Every so often, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Small, fast, always disappearing before I could get a clear look. By midday, I reached the pond from 2 days ago. I paused to drink some water and steady my breathing. That's when I noticed something that stopped me cold. Across the water, in the thick trees, something was standing there. A figure. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't another hiker. It was standing too still, too rigid. I couldn't make out details, just the outline of a person. I didn't move. Neither did it. My skin crawled. I don't know how long we stood there, staring at each other across the pond, but eventually, I forced myself to move. I turned and walked as calmly as I could, every instinct screaming at me to run. The next few hours were a blur of adrenaline. I pushed harder than I ever had, barely stopping. The sun was dipping low when I finally reached my first campsite. Relief washed over me. I was close to the trailhead. One more night and I'd be out. I forced myself to eat, then climbed into my tent, exhausted but alert. I kept my knife close, listening. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to a sound that sent ice through my veins. Breathing, right outside my tent. Slow, deep, controlled. Not an animal, not some random noise. Someone was standing right there. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My mind raced. What do I do? Then, just as suddenly as it started, the breathing stopped. A few seconds later, the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps faded into the trees. I didn't sleep. At first light, I packed up and practically ran the final miles to my car. When I reached the trailhead, I was shaking. My car was the only one in the lot. I jumped in, locked the doors, and drove without looking back. I don't know who or what was out there with me. I never saw a face, never heard a voice, but something was there watching, following. And I knew, deep in my gut, that if I had stayed one more night, I wouldn't have made it out. I had been planning this solo camping trip for weeks. I wanted something remote, somewhere deep in the woods where I could be alone, surrounded by nothing but trees, the wind, and the distant sounds of wildlife. I had done plenty of solo trips before, so I wasn't nervous. If anything, I looked forward to the isolation. The place I had chosen was a state forest, about 2 hours from home. It wasn't a maintained campsite, just a spot I had found on a map near a small river. The plan was simple: hike in about 5 miles, set up camp, and spend the weekend unwinding. No cell service, no people, just me and the wilderness. I parked my car at a pull-off where the gravel road ended and started hiking. The trail was faint but visible, probably used more by deer than people. The air was crisp, the sun warm but not too hot. My pack was heavy, but I liked the weight. It reminded me I was prepared. I had my tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, a first aid kit, and everything else I needed. I knew what I was doing. The hike in was uneventful. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the leaf-covered ground and the occasional rustling of something in the brush. Probably squirrels, maybe a deer. I found the spot I had picked out on the map, a small clearing near the river. It was perfect. Flat ground for the tent, plenty of firewood, and close enough to the water that I could refill my bottles. Setting up camp was routine. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and filtered some water. By the time the sun started dipping, I had a small fire going and was eating a simple meal. The sound of the river was soothing, and the cool evening air felt good after the hike. As the fire died down, I crawled into my tent. I wasn't tired yet, but there wasn't much else to do. No phone to scroll through, no music, just the dark forest and the sounds of the night. I lay there listening. It was peaceful. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned out completely, and my tent was pitch black. I listened, trying to figure out if a noise had woken me up. First, nothing. Just the usual sounds of the forest at night. Then I heard it. A snap like a branch breaking, not far from my tent. I held my breath, listening harder. Another sound, this time the soft crunch of leaves. Something was moving outside. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on. The tent lit up, but I couldn't see anything outside. The sound stopped. Probably a deer, I told myself. Maybe a raccoon. I was in their territory. Nothing unusual. Still, I felt uneasy. I stayed still, listening for what felt like an hour, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I let myself relax and drifted back to sleep. Morning came, and with it, the comfort of daylight. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, stretching. Everything looked normal. The river, the trees, my camp. It was all just as I had left it. But then I noticed something. About 20 feet from my tent, the leaves and dirt were disturbed. Not just a little, something had been standing there, moving around. I walked over and crouched down. There were prints. Not clear ones, but enough to tell they weren't deer tracks. Too big for a raccoon or anything like that. I tried to shake it off. Maybe a black bear had wandered through. They usually avoided people, but it wasn't unheard of. I decided to be more careful, make sure to keep my food sealed up tight. I spent the day hiking. The forest was beautiful, the kind of place that made you forget about everything else. I climbed up to a ridge and looked out over the trees stretching for miles. No roads, no buildings, just endless wilderness. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was starting to set. I got another fire going, ate dinner, and sat watching the flames. Then, just as the last bit of light faded from the sky, I heard it again. A branch snapping, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. Nothing. Just darkness beyond the reach of the beam. I told myself it was fine. Animals moved at night. That was normal. But then I heard breathing. Slow, heavy breathing. Not mine. It was coming from just beyond the trees. I stood up slowly, gripping the flashlight tight. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was there. And then, just like that, it stopped. The woods were silent again. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound put me on edge. I kept my knife close, not that it would do much against a bear. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed up quickly, stuffing everything into my pack without bothering to organize it. I just wanted to get out. The hike back felt different. The forest, which had felt peaceful before, now felt oppressive. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like something watching me. I was about 2 miles from my car when I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, heading the same direction I was. Someone had been following me. I moved faster, nearly running. My pack bounced against my back. But I didn't care. I just wanted to reach my car. When I finally saw it through the trees, relief flooded me. I rushed forward, yanking my keys from my pocket. I unlocked the door, threw my pack inside, and got in. As I started the engine, I looked back at the trail, just for a second, and that's when I saw him. A man standing at the edge of the trees, too far to see clearly, but close enough that I knew he was watching me. I didn't wait. I put the car in drive and got out of there as fast as I could. I don't know who he was or how long he had been out there. Maybe he had just been passing through. Maybe he had no bad intentions. But I'll never go back to that forest again. And I'll never camp alone. I had been planning the trip for months. A week alone in the backcountry, far from people, far from noise. Just me, my pack, and the wilderness. It was something I had done before, but never this deep, never this isolated. The forest I chose was vast, stretching for miles with little sign of human interference. The trails were faint, used more by wildlife than people. That's what I wanted, complete solitude. I parked my truck at the trailhead just after sunrise, shouldered my pack, and started walking. The first few hours were uneventful, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the distant sounds of birds. The air was crisp, cool in the shade but warming fast under the sun. My plan was to hike about 15 miles in, set up camp, and spend a few days exploring before heading back out. I had my GPS, a map, and a compass. I felt prepared. By midday, I had left the main trail and was following an old game path. It was narrow, winding through dense trees, barely distinguishable from the rest of the forest floor. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Birds grew scarce, and the rustling of small animals faded. It wasn't eerie, not yet, just different. After about 6 hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing by a stream. It was perfect. Flat ground, a water source, and just enough space to set up my tent without feeling exposed. I dropped my pack, stretched my shoulders, and got to work setting up camp. As evening fell, I sat by the water, filtering enough to last me through the night. The sun dipped below the trees, casting long shadows. I ate a simple meal, packed away my food properly, and crawled into my tent. Sleep came easily, the exhaustion of the hike wearing me down. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The forest was still, no wind, no distant calls of animals, just silence. I listened for a while but heard nothing unusual. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next day was spent exploring. I followed the stream, testing my bearings with the map and compass, making sure I could navigate back without the GPS. I noted landmarks, fallen trees, a boulder split in two, a patch of ferns larger than the rest. On my way back to camp, I found tracks, large ones. At first, I thought they might be from a bear, but the shape was off. Too long, the toes too pronounced. I crouched down, running my fingers along the indentations in the soil. It wasn't human, but it also wasn't any animal I was familiar with. I stood, scanning the trees. Nothing, no movement, just the overwhelming quiet. I told myself it was probably a misidentified bear print and moved on. That night, I woke again. This time, I heard something. A soft rustling, slow and deliberate. Not the random movement of wind or small creatures. It was close. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound moved around my camp, steady, unhurried. I stayed still, heart pounding. My bear spray was within reach, my knife even closer. The noise continued for what felt like hours before it stopped abruptly. I stayed awake until the first light crept through the fabric of my tent. Stepping outside, everything looked normal. No tracks, no disturbances. I convinced myself it had been an animal, something curious but harmless. Still, unease settled deep in my gut. I decided to move camp. I hiked another 6 miles before setting up again. The new spot was similar, by a stream nestled in trees. I spent the rest of the day fishing, trying to shake off the discomfort from the night before. That night, the noises came back. Louder this time. Footsteps. Not the erratic movements of an animal, but something walking. 2 feet, not 4. They stopped just outside my tent. I could hear breathing, deep, steady. I didn't move. I gripped my knife so tightly my fingers ached. Minutes passed. The breathing continued. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The footsteps moved away, fading into the trees. I stayed awake until dawn, my nerves shot. When I finally gathered the courage to check outside, there were prints. Not boot prints, but not quite bare feet either. Longer, narrower, deep impressions in the soil. I broke camp immediately, packing in record time. I didn't care about the extra weight of wet gear, I just needed to leave. I hiked fast, barely stopping, moving until my legs burned. The forest felt different now. The silence was suffocating. The trees seemed to press in. Every rustle, every shift of leaves sent a spike of fear through my chest. By late afternoon, I reached a familiar landmark. I was close to the trailhead. Relief began to creep in until I saw them. More prints, dozens of them, some overlapping mine from the day before, some newer pressed deep into the dirt. I didn't think. I ran. My pack slammed against my back. My breath came in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I saw my truck, sitting untouched at the edge of the trailhead. Throwing my pack into the bed, I jumped in, locking the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I stole one last glance at the tree line. Something was standing there, tall, thin, just within the shadows. Watching, I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I drove until the forest was miles behind me. I never went back. Whatever was out there, it wanted me gone. And I listened. I had always been careful when camping alone. I planned meticulously, checked the weather, told someone where I was going. But even the best laid plans can unravel when nature and people have other ideas. This trip was meant to be simple. A 2-night solo camp in a quiet national forest. Nothing extreme. I picked a spot near a creek, about 5 miles from the trailhead. The hike in was peaceful. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dense canopy of pines and maples, dappling the ground in shifting patches of gold. Birds chattered in the underbrush, and the air smelled of damp earth and sun-warmed pine needles. I set up my small tent, arranged my gear, and took a short walk along the creek before making dinner. By the time the sun dipped below the ridgeline, I was ready to crawl into my sleeping bag and call it a night. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke early, made coffee, and decided to explore the area. I followed the creek downstream, moving slowly, stopping to examine animal tracks in the soft mud, taking in the quiet stillness of the forest. It was supposed to be a relaxing day, but as I turned back toward camp, I noticed something odd. A single boot print, not mine, in the soft earth near the creek. It wasn't fresh, maybe a day old. Still, it made me uneasy. I hadn't seen anyone on my way in, and I had picked this spot specifically because it was off-trail. Maybe a hunter or another camper had passed through earlier in the week. I shook it off and kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Back at camp, I forced myself to go through normal motions, collecting more firewood, boiling water for dinner, double-checking my gear. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. By dusk, the forest was settling into its nighttime rhythm. The occasional rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl. I ate my meal, watched the fire burn low, then crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. I woke sometime in the night to the sound of movement. Not an animal. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Close. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps stopped near my tent. The fire had died to embers, leaving the campsite in near total darkness. I gripped the handle of my knife, heart hammering so hard I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. A long silence, then the sound of retreating footsteps, moving back into the forest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay there, listening, every nerve in my body on edge. As soon as the sky lightened with dawn, I unzipped the tent and stepped out, knife still in hand. There were no signs of anyone, no tracks, nothing moved among the trees. But I knew what I had heard. I needed to leave. I packed quickly, rolling up my sleeping bag, stuffing my gear into my pack with clumsy urgency. I kept looking up, scanning the tree line. Nothing, no movement, but the feeling hadn't left. As I hoisted my pack onto my shoulders and turned toward the trail, something caught my eye. A small object, sitting on a rock near my dead fire pit. A single spent bullet casing. It hadn't been there the night before. My stomach twisted. Someone had been here. They had stood in my camp while I slept. And they had left me a message. I didn't stop moving. I walked as fast as I could, resisting the urge to break into a full sprint. My ears strained for any sound behind me, but the forest was silent. Too silent. I made it back to my car in record time, fumbling with my keys, throwing my pack in the back seat. Only when I was inside, doors locked, did I let myself breathe. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the tree line. Nothing, just the still, empty woods. But I knew better. Someone had been watching, and they had wanted me to know. I never went back. I never considered myself an inexperienced camper. I had spent years hiking and camping alone, taking the necessary precautions, knowing the risks. I wasn't careless. I knew how to read the land, I knew how to pack efficiently, and I knew how to keep myself safe. But none of that mattered when I found myself deep in the wilderness, utterly alone with something or someone watching me. It started as just another trip. A weekend out in the woods, alone with my thoughts, away from the noise of the world. I had planned the route carefully, chosen a remote campsite miles away from any official trails. It was the kind of place where no one just happened to be. You had to work to get there. That's what I wanted, real isolation. No people, no distractions. Just me, my gear, and the quiet of the forest. The hike in was uneventful, though longer than I expected. The terrain was rougher than the maps had suggested, and I lost an hour navigating a steep, rocky incline. The dense undergrowth made progress slow, but by the time the sun dipped low in the sky, I had reached my destination. A small clearing near a stream, surrounded by thick pine trees. It was perfect, isolated, quiet. The only sounds were the wind through the trees and the trickling water nearby. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent close to the tree line where I'd have some cover from the wind. I started a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat back against a log, staring into the flames as the sky darkened above me. There was something peaceful about being out there, away from everything. I felt safe. I had no reason not to. Then, I noticed something odd. The usual sounds of the forest had gone quiet. The insects, the birds, everything had stopped. It wasn't immediate. It was gradual, like a slow fade into silence. I hadn't realized it at first, but now that I did, I couldn't ignore it. I scanned the tree line. There was nothing, just the shifting shadows of the branches swaying in the wind. Still, the quiet gnawed at me. I wasn't afraid, not yet, but my instincts told me something wasn't right. I told myself it was just a natural lull in the sounds of the forest. It happened sometimes. Animals went quiet when larger predators were near, but there were no big predators in this part of the woods. No bears, no wolves. Nothing that should make the forest this silent. I shook off the unease and crawled into my tent, zipping it shut behind me. I left the fire burning low outside, just enough to cast a faint glow through the thin fabric of my shelter. I lay down, listening, Still nothing, just the wind. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it, a sound, faint, distant, a rustling in the brush. My eyes snapped open, my body rigid. I listened, heart pounding. It was probably just an animal, a deer maybe, a raccoon, but something about it felt wrong. The sound wasn't random. It wasn't the occasional crunch of leaves or snap of a twig. It was deliberate, slow, steady, like footsteps. I held my breath, straining to hear. The steps continued, moving closer. Then they stopped, just outside my camp. I lay frozen, gripping the handle of my knife. The fire outside flickered, casting shifting shadows against the tent walls. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was out there, standing, watching. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. I forced myself to breathe, muscles aching from tension. I waited, ears straining for the faintest sound. Then, just as slowly as it had come, the presence retreated. The footsteps moved away, back into the woods, swallowed by the night. I didn't sleep. I lay awake until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. The moment the sun was up, I was outside, scanning the perimeter of my camp. There were footprints, not animal tracks, human, barefoot. The prints circled my tent, stopping just inches from where I had been sleeping. I packed up immediately. I didn't care about breakfast. I didn't care about rest. I just wanted out. I moved fast, retracing my path from the day before. The forest was awake again, the sounds of birds and insects filling the air, but it didn't comfort me. I felt exposed. Then I noticed something that stopped me cold. There was another set of footprints, following mine, fresh. I picked up my pace, moving as fast as I could without outright running. My heart was pounding, my throat dry. The feeling of being watched never left me. I kept checking over my shoulder, but I saw nothing. I hiked for hours, barely stopping to catch my breath. My legs burned, my pack dug into my shoulders, but I didn't slow down. I just needed to get back to my car, back to safety. And then, finally, I saw it. My car, parked at the lonely trailhead where I had left it. Relief flooded through me. I rushed forward, yanking my keys from my pocket. Then I saw the smudged handprint on the driver's side window, a bare hand, pressed against the glass, as if someone had been waiting for me to return. I didn't think. I just got in, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I never went back to that place. I never told anyone what happened, but I still think about it. About the footprints, about the handprint, about whoever or whatever was out there with me that night. I had planned this trip for months, a solo camping trek into the remote mountains of Idaho, a place I had studied on maps and in old trail guides. I wanted solitude, the kind that presses down on you, the kind that reminds you just how small you are. I got it. The hike in was long, almost 16 miles from where I had parked my truck, following a thinning trail that eventually vanished into the undergrowth. I had a GPS, but I prided myself on my map and compass skills, navigating by the contour lines and the shape of the land. The first day was grueling. My pack was heavier than I had hoped, my boots still stiff despite wearing them on shorter hikes to break them in. But I made it to the small alpine lake I had chosen on my map, secluded, pristine, untouched. I set up my tent near the tree line, close to the water but not too close, mindful of sudden wind gusts or unexpected rises in the lake's level. The air was thin, crisp, the scent of pine thick. I filtered water, made a meal, and sat watching the last light fade behind jagged peaks. There was no one out here, no one for miles. That first night was uneventful, cold, but nothing I wasn't prepared for. The wind picked up around midnight, howling down through the valleys, bending the trees, making my tent shudder. I slept in bursts, waking to adjust my sleeping bag, listening to the wind tear through the high branches. The second day, I explored the ridges above the lake, climbing until my legs burned. The view was worth it. Miles of untouched wilderness stretching in all directions. No roads, No signs of human interference, just raw land. I stayed up there until late afternoon, then made my way back down, my knees aching from the descent. Back at camp, I cooked, stretched, and watched the stars blink into existence. That night, something changed. I woke to a sound, something crunching outside my tent. I stayed still, listening. The sound wasn't constant, just a few steps, then nothing. Maybe a deer, maybe a bear. I had my bear spray, my knife. I wasn't too worried, but I reached for them anyway. Minutes passed. Silence. Then, another sound, but this time from a different direction. A shifting of weight on pine needles. Close. I held my breath, listening. The wind had died down, and the night was eerily still. The sound came again, footsteps, deliberate. Not the light, erratic movement of an animal sniffing around. These were slow, careful steps. I swallowed hard. My tent fabric was thin. Whatever was out there was just feet away. I had a headlamp within reach, but I didn't want to turn it on. I didn't want whatever was outside to know exactly where I was. The steps moved again, circling my tent. My pulse hammered in my ears. I debated making a noise, trying to scare it off, but something in my gut told me to stay quiet. Then silence again. Minutes stretched. Nothing. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke to pale morning light filtering through the tent fabric. Everything seemed normal. Birds chirped. The lake was still. But when I stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints. Human. They circled my tent, trailing off toward the trees. They hadn't been there the day before. My own boot prints were deeper, heavier, but these were lighter, as if the person had been stepping carefully, avoiding noise. Cold knot formed in my stomach. I was alone. I had seen no one on my way in, no signs of other campers, no vehicles. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a lost hiker, maybe someone who had camped nearby and stumbled upon my tent in the dark. But why wouldn't they have called out? Why move so quietly? I spent the morning on edge, my ears tuned to every sound. I thought about packing up and leaving, but the thought of hiking out alone, possibly with someone watching me, made my skin crawl. Instead, I decided to stay another night but move my camp. I found a new spot, deeper in the trees, further from the lake, with better visibility of the surroundings. I spent extra time making sure no clear trail led directly to my tent. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jolt awake. I clutched my knife, my bear spray within arm's reach. The wind had returned, masking any outside noises. But sometime around 3 a.m., I heard them again. Footsteps. They stopped right outside my tent. I stopped breathing. The thin fabric was the only thing between me and whoever or whatever was out there. I wanted to move, to make a noise, but fear kept me frozen. The steps shifted slightly, then retreated. Slow, deliberate, then silence. I didn't sleep again. As soon as the sky lightened, I packed up camp as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I stuffed gear into my pack. The whole time I felt watched, exposed, vulnerable. The hike out was brutal. My pack felt heavier, my legs sluggish. I forced myself to move quickly, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The feeling of being followed never faded. I reached my truck just as the sun began to dip, throwing everything into the cab, locking the doors the moment I was inside. I sat there for a long time, my heart still hammering. Then, just as I was about to start the engine, I saw it. A figure standing at the tree line, too far to make out details, but close enough that I knew they were watching me. Just standing, not moving. I turned the key, the engine roaring to life. The figure didn't flinch. I didn't stick around to find out more. I threw the truck into gear and tore down the rough dirt road, my tires kicking up dust. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror more times than I could count. By the time I hit pavement, my hands were shaking so bad I had to pull over. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. I'll never go back. I always liked camping, or at least I thought I did. Maybe it was because I grew up with it. My dad was the kind of guy who swore by the woods. "Nothing clears the mind like fresh air and a quiet place," he'd say. So, when I got a chance to take a solo camping trip up in the mountains, I didn't think twice. I had my gear packed, everything checked twice. I wasn't an amateur. I knew how to set up camp, how to keep food safe from animals, how to handle myself. The place I chose was deep in a national forest, about a 3-hour drive from any major town. It wasn't an official campground, just a spot I found after scouring hiking forums. People said it was beautiful, remote, and peaceful. That's exactly what I wanted. The drive was smooth. I followed the GPS, then a dirt road, then finally parked where the trailhead began. No one else was around, which was fine by me. I liked the isolation. I strapped on my pack and started hiking. The trail wasn't well marked, but I had a downloaded map and a compass. It was a bit overgrown in places, but nothing too rough. It took me a couple of hours to reach my planned campsite, a clearing near a small creek. The place was perfect. Flat ground, plenty of trees for shade, and just enough underbrush to feel enclosed but not suffocating. I set up my tent, got my firewood stacked, and spent the rest of the evening enjoying the quiet. The air smelled fresh, like damp earth and pine. The only sounds were birds, the rustling of small critters, and the occasional breeze shaking the branches above. As the sun dipped below the tree line, I made a small fire, cooked a quick meal, and sat there staring at the flames. There was no cell signal, which was expected. I had my emergency radio and a whistle just in case, but everything felt fine. More than fine. This was what I wanted. Peace, quiet, no stress, just me and the wilderness. But something changed when night fell completely. I noticed it first when the usual sounds of the forest faded away. No crickets, no rustling, just an eerie silence. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe the animals just settled in for the night. I tossed another log into the fire, trying to ignore the weird tension in the air. Then I heard something, a snap. Not just any snap, but the kind of sound a large animal makes when stepping on a thick branch. I sat up, ears straining. I had a flashlight beside me, so I grabbed it and aimed it toward the trees. Nothing, just blackness and the outlines of trees swaying slightly in the breeze. I tried to rationalize it. A deer, maybe. A bear, worst case scenario, but my food was secured in a bear canister away from my tent. I stood up, scanning the perimeter of my campsite, my gut twisting a little. Another sound, this time closer. It wasn't just one thing moving. There were multiple. Footsteps, human footsteps. I held my breath. The steps were slow, deliberate, moving just outside the reach of my fire's light. I knew what animals sounded like. This wasn't an animal. I wasn't alone. Every instinct screamed at me to do something, but I didn't want to overreact. If it was another camper, they would have called out, right? They wouldn't just be lurking in the dark like that. My pulse hammered in my ears. I grabbed my knife from my pack and stood completely still, listening. The footsteps stopped. Silence again. Then, a whisper of movement, like fabric brushing against a branch. Someone was out there, watching. I forced myself to breathe evenly. If I panicked, I'd make mistakes. I had options. I could grab my gear and bolt, but running blindly in the dark was dangerous. I could call out, but that could make things worse. I could stay put and wait, but that meant spending the night knowing someone was right there. I decided to keep the fire going. Fire meant light, and light meant visibility. I stoked the flames, making them brighter, hotter. I sat with my back to a tree, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. If someone was going to try something, they'd have to come through the light first. Hours passed. My fire burned down to glowing embers. No more noises, no more movement. The night dragged on, the weight of exhaustion pulling at me, but I didn't dare close my eyes. Then, just before dawn, I heard it. Faint, distant footsteps retreating back into the forest. Slow, deliberate, but leaving. Whoever had been watching me was finally gone. I didn't waste time packing up. As soon as the sky lightened enough to see, I gathered my gear, barely stopping to eat. I moved quickly, double-checking my surroundings as I hiked back toward my car. Every snapped twig, every rustling leaf made my heart pound. When I reached my vehicle, I locked the doors the second I got in. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't feel safe until I was miles away, back on paved roads, back near civilization. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know this: I'll never go camping alone again. I had planned the trip for months. A solo camping expedition deep in the mountains, away from the noise of the world. I wanted to test myself to see how well I could survive with only the essentials. I had experience in the backcountry, and I was confident in my abilities. Maybe too confident. The drive out to the trailhead took nearly 5 hours, most of it on winding dirt roads that seemed to lead deeper into nothing. I parked my truck at a small, unmarked lot, shouldered my pack, and started down the trail. The plan was to hike about 10 miles in, set up camp by a remote alpine lake, spend a few nights, then hike back out. The weather forecast was good, cool at night, warm during the day, no storms expected. Everything seemed perfect. The first day went smoothly. The trail was steep in places, but the air was crisp and fresh, the kind that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive. I passed no one, which I liked. The whole reason I came out here was to be alone. By late afternoon, I reached the lake. It was beautiful. Cold, clear water, towering pines lining the shore, snow-capped peaks in the distance. I found a flat clearing about 50 yards from the water, set up my tent, and made a small fire. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, the temperature dropped quickly. I cooked a simple meal, ate by the fire, and crawled into my sleeping bag as darkness settled around me. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of rustling. My first thought was a bear. My heart pounded as I reached for my flashlight, but when I turned it on, the noise stopped. I shined the beam outside the tent, scanning the trees. Nothing, probably just a small animal. Still, I kept my bear spray close and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning was uneventful. I spent the day fishing and hiking around the lake, enjoying the solitude. I felt completely at peace. But as the afternoon stretched on, I started to get an uneasy feeling. It was subtle, like a pressure in my chest that I couldn't explain. The air felt heavier. The silence, which had been soothing the day before, now felt oppressive. The thought crossed my mind that maybe I wasn't alone. That night, I built a bigger fire than usual. I sat beside it, listening, watching. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. I told myself I was imagining things. But just before I went to bed, I noticed something strange. The forest was completely silent. No insects, no night birds, no wind. Just nothing. Sleep didn't come easily. Every noise outside made me tense. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. Then I woke up to something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, moving just outside my tent. My pulse hammered in my ears. I reached for my knife, gripping it so tight my fingers ached. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath. Nothing. Minutes passed. Then I heard them again, circling my tent. I knew I had to act. Staying inside wasn't an option. I needed to see what was out there. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. I burst out, shining the light in every direction. Nothing, just the trees, the lake, the fire now smoldering. My heart was racing, but there was no one there. I walked a slow circle around my campsite, scanning the ground. No fresh tracks, nothing to prove that anyone had been there at all. I told myself it had to be my imagination, that I was spooking myself. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next day, I debated whether to leave. Something in my gut told me to go, but my pride wouldn't let me. I had come out here for 3 nights, and I wasn't about to let fear cut my trip short. I spent the day trying to shake off the paranoia. I hiked further from camp, explored the ridges above the lake, but the feeling never fully left. As night fell, I forced myself to act normal. I made dinner, sat by the fire, but when I turned to grab my water bottle, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A footprint, a human footprint, fresh in the dirt, right behind my tent. And it wasn't mine. I stood frozen, my mind racing. I wasn't alone. Someone had been here watching me. Maybe they still were. I killed the fire, grabbed my knife, and sat in the darkness. I listened. Hours passed. Then, just after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Closer this time. Slow. Deliberate. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my pack, my headlamp, and I left. I didn't care about breaking camp. I just needed to get out of there. The hike back was brutal. The trail was rough. The darkness made every step feel treacherous, but I pushed on. I didn't stop until I saw my truck. I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and sped down the dirt road. I didn't look back. It wasn't until I got home that I noticed the final detail, the one that still haunts me to this day. On the back window of my truck, written in the dust, was a single word: leaving. I haven't been back to that lake since. I don't know why I thought I could handle it alone. Maybe it was arrogance, or maybe I was just desperate to prove something to myself. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, but nothing this remote, nothing this risky. The plan was simple: a 3-day camping trip in a little visited canyon in Utah. I wanted solitude, quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel small against the world. The first day had gone fine. I parked my truck at a small pull-off near an unmarked trail, hiked about 7 miles into the canyon, and set up camp near a dry wash. The sun had been brutal, beating down on me even though it was early spring. I drank more water than I planned to, but I figured I'd just be extra careful rationing the rest. My pack felt heavier than usual, the weight of my gear pressing down on my shoulders. That night, the wind howled through the canyon walls. It wasn't comforting, not the way wind in the trees might be. It echoed, a hollow sound, like something moving just out of sight. I ignored it, forced myself to focus on the simple tasks of making camp, eating, setting up my sleeping bag. The stars were incredible, clear and cold. The air had a sharp bite, so different from the heat of the day. The trouble started the next morning. I woke early, ate a quick breakfast, and decided to explore deeper into the canyon. I packed a day's worth of food and water, a small first aid kit, and my GPS. The walls of the canyon narrowed as I went further, and soon I was picking my way over loose rock and dried-up creek beds. The silence was absolute. Even my footsteps seemed muffled by the dust. I was maybe 5 miles from my camp when I found the slot canyon. It was narrow, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through in some places, but I was drawn to it. Something about the smooth, twisting rock, the way the light cut through at strange angles. I went in. It was slow going, twisting my body sideways to fit through the tighter spots, bracing my hands against the cool stone. The air was cooler in there, shaded from the sun, and I felt relief from the heat. I kept going, pushing forward, certain it would open up eventually. I was wrong. About 100 yards in, my backpack snagged on an outcrop. I shifted my weight to free it, and my foot slipped. My right leg slid into a narrow crevice. My knee jammed against rock, and my torso twisted awkwardly. I went down hard. The pain was immediate. A sharp explosion in my knee, followed by a dull, throbbing ache. My left arm, which I'd thrown out to catch myself, was scraped raw against the canyon wall. My backpack pinned me at an awkward angle, pressing me against the rock. Panicked, I tried to pull my leg free, but any movement sent searing pain through my knee. I could feel it swelling already, tight and hot. My pack was wedged between my back and the canyon wall, limiting my movement. My right arm was trapped beneath me, and the more I struggled, the worse it got. I stopped, took a breath, assessed. I wasn't bleeding badly, just scrapes. But my knee, that was bad. It wasn't broken, I was sure of that, but it felt wrong, like something inside had been stretched too far or torn. I reached for my pack with my free hand, shifting my weight as carefully as I could. I needed to get my leg out. My water bottle pressed against my back, half empty already. The next few hours were a blur of pain and exhaustion. I tried every position I could think of to free my leg, but nothing worked. The angle was too sharp, and every movement sent fresh waves of pain through my knee. I screamed in frustration, the sound swallowed instantly by the canyon. I needed to conserve my water, my food, my energy. I needed to think. I had told no one exactly where I was going. No one would be looking for me for at least another day, maybe more. If I ran out of water before then, I forced the thought away. The sun moved across the sky, and the canyon shifted from cool shade to an oven. My throat was dry, my lips cracked. The pain in my knee became a steady pulse, a reminder of my mistake. I rationed sips of water, tried to keep my breathing slow. By the second night, I was shaking uncontrollably. Dehydration, pain, fear. I drifted in and out of consciousness, waking to the sound of my own ragged breathing. On the third morning, I made a decision. If I didn't get out today, I wouldn't get out at all. I bit down on my sleeve, braced my hands against the rock, and pulled. Agony tore through my knee, and I nearly blacked out. I kept pulling inch by inch until my leg slid free. Collapsed, gasping. My leg was useless. The pain was blinding, but I was out. I crawled. The slot canyon felt longer on the way out. Every inch was a struggle. The sun was brutal, beating down on my raw skin. My water was gone. My vision swam, but I kept going. When I finally emerged, I sobbed. I wasn't safe yet. I still had to make it back to my camp. I dragged myself forward, using my arms, my good leg, pushing through the sand and rock. Every movement sent fire through my knee. I made it back to camp as the sun dipped low. My tent was there, my gear untouched. I fumbled for my emergency whistle and blew it again and again until my throat was raw. I don't remember passing out. I woke to the sound of voices. Rangers, hikers. I was too weak to answer, but they found me. They carried me out, gave me water, splinted my leg. At the hospital, they told me I had torn my ACL, that if I had stayed another day, dehydration would have finished me. I still don't know why I went into that slot canyon. Maybe curiosity, maybe stupidity. I do know one thing. I'll never go in one alone again. I always loved the idea of camping. The thought of getting away from everything, leaving behind the hum of electricity and the constant notifications from my phone, sounded like exactly what I needed. So when I finally got a long weekend off from work, I packed up my gear and drove out to a quiet spot in the woods. It was a place I'd found online, not an official campsite, but a secluded spot deep in the national forest. The kind of place where I wouldn't have to worry about noisy neighbors or crowded trails. The drive was long, mostly winding roads with thick trees lining both sides. The sun was getting low by the time I turned onto the old dirt road that led to my campsite. My tires crunched over gravel and fallen leaves, and I had to slow down to avoid the deep potholes that dotted the road. After about 20 minutes of careful driving, I found the clearing. It was perfect, flat, surrounded by trees, and just a short walk to a small stream. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent near the tree line and getting a fire going before the sun fully disappeared. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that lets you know summer is finally giving way to fall. I sat by the fire, cooking a simple meal over the flames, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful. I didn't hear any voices, no distant sounds of cars or civilization, just the occasional rustle in the underbrush and the calls of night insects. This was exactly what I had been looking for. After eating, I took a short walk to the stream. The moon was bright enough that I didn't need a flashlight. The water was clear, reflecting the silver light from above. I crouched down, letting the cold water run over my fingers, and just sat there for a while, breathing in the fresh air. Felt good to be out here. I made my way back to camp and settled into my tent for the night. Took me a while to fall asleep. I wasn't scared, but the silence was almost too much. It was different from the kind of quiet I was used to at home. Out here, every little sound seemed louder. The rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch, the wind moving through the trees. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but something felt wrong. I wasn't sure if it was a sound or just a feeling, but my body knew before my mind did. I lay still, holding my breath, listening. The fire outside had burned down to embers, casting a dull, orange glow around the clearing. The trees beyond were dark, shadows stretching and shifting in the faint light. Then I heard it. Footsteps, not an animal. Too heavy. Slow, deliberate steps, crunching the dry leaves just outside my tent. My heart started pounding, and I stayed perfectly still, trying to convince myself that I was imagining it. Maybe a deer? A bear? But no, it was different. It sounded too much like a person. I reached for my knife, keeping my movements slow. The footsteps stopped. I waited, straining my ears. Silence. My mind raced. Should I call out? Should I stay quiet? I didn't want to make any sudden moves, so I just lay there, gripping the knife so hard my hands started to ache. Then I heard something worse. Breathing, just outside the thin fabric of my tent. Slow, steady breathing. I felt paralyzed, my body refusing to move. The breathing stayed there for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, the footsteps started again, moving away this time. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore, then forced myself to sit up as quietly as possible. My entire body was trembling. I had to decide what to do. If I unzipped the tent and shined my flashlight outside, I might see something I didn't want to see. But if I stayed in here, I was trapped. My car was parked about 20 yards away, but that felt like a mile in the darkness. I listened for a long time. Nothing. The forest had gone completely silent, as if everything else was holding its breath. 2. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, then slowly unzipped the tent. The fire was barely alive, casting just enough light to see the immediate area. Nothing. The trees stood tall and still, their trunks stretching into the blackness. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it around the clearing. Empty. No tracks, no sign of anything unusual. But I knew what I had heard. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, watching the trees. Every now and then, I thought I heard something. A faint rustle, a shift in the darkness, but nothing ever came close again. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I packed up my gear as fast as I could. My hands were still shaking as I stuffed everything into my backpack and doused the fire. I didn't care about breakfast, didn't care about taking my time. I just needed to get out of there. The drive back down the dirt road felt longer than before. Every shadow between the trees made my skin crawl. It wasn't until I hit the main road that I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. I never found out who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just some other camper who had wandered too close to my sight. Maybe it was some local messing with me, or maybe it was something worse. I haven't been camping alone since. I've always loved camping, the quiet of the woods, the fresh air, the feeling of being away from everything. This trip was supposed to be like any other. I picked a secluded spot in a national forest, far from the usual campsites, hoping for solitude. I packed light but made sure I had the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, food, water, and a first aid kit. I drove out early in the morning, the sun just rising as I left town. It was a 3-hour drive, mostly down highways, then onto winding back roads that turned into dirt trails. The forest was dense, tall pines and thick undergrowth. The only sounds were birds and the occasional rustling of small animals in the bushes. I found a clearing about a mile off the main dirt road and set up my tent near a small creek. The water was cold and clear, perfect for washing up and refilling my bottles. I gathered firewood, enough for the night, and set up a small fire pit. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. By the time the sun started setting, I had my fire going and a simple meal cooking. The smell of burning wood mixed with the scent of the pines. The forest felt alive but calm, the distant chirping of crickets filling the air. As darkness settled in, I sat by the fire, listening. The occasional snap of a branch in the distance reminded me I wasn't alone out here. Animals moved through the forest, unseen but always present. The first strange thing happened around midnight. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and I was in my tent, half asleep. A noise woke me, a sharp, distinct cracking sound, like a branch breaking underfoot. It was close, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. My mind went to the usual possibilities: deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent slowly, and shined the light outside. Nothing. The trees stood still, the undergrowth unmoving. I listened for a while, but whatever made the noise was either gone or staying perfectly still. Eventually, I zipped the tent back up and tried to sleep. A few hours later, I woke again. This time, there was no sound, just a feeling. The kind of feeling that makes your skin crawl, like being watched. My fire was nearly out, just faintly glowing coals. I strained my ears, but the forest was dead silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. I laid there, heart pounding, trying to rationalize it. Maybe I was just paranoid, but that feeling didn't go away. Morning came and the feeling was gone. The forest was back to normal, birds singing, the breeze moving through the trees. I convinced myself I had overreacted. I spent the day hiking, exploring the area, following the creek for a few miles. It was beautiful, untouched wilderness. I found animal tracks, deer, some smaller ones that looked like raccoons or foxes, and one set that seemed off. Too large for a dog, but not quite right for a wolf. I couldn't place it, but I told myself it was just an odd angle or maybe an old print distorted by the soil. That night, I made sure to build my fire bigger, hoping the light would keep animals away. As I sat by the flames, that feeling crept back. The sense of being watched. The hair on my arms stood up, my instincts screaming at me. But there was nothing there. I forced myself to relax and eventually crawled into my tent. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound felt too loud. The snapping of twigs, the rustling of leaves. It all seemed deliberate. I was drifting in and out of sleep when something made me fully awake. A low, steady breathing. Not mine. Outside the tent. Just beyond the thin fabric. My heart nearly stopped. I didn't move, barely even breathed. The sound continued, slow and measured, just feet away. I reached for my flashlight, hand shaking. Then suddenly it stopped. Total silence. I didn't know what was worse, the sound itself or the way it just vanished. I lay there for what felt like hours before I gathered the courage to unzip the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had burned down again, the woods dark and quiet. I couldn't see anything unusual, but I didn't trust my eyes. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching my knife, every small sound making my pulse spike. When the sun finally rose, I packed up. I wasn't going to spend another night here. As I took down my tent, I noticed something strange in the dirt near my campsite. Footprints, human, barefoot, but the stride was off. Too long, too uneven. The prints circled my campsite, stopping just a few feet from my tent. I didn't stay to investigate. I threw my gear into my pack and started hiking back to my car. The whole way I felt exposed, vulnerable. Every rustling leaf, every snapped twig made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me. When I finally reached my car, I felt a massive wave of relief. I tossed my gear in the back and locked the doors before starting the engine. As I drove down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure standing at the tree line. But there was nothing, just the empty forest. I never reported it. What would I even say? I wasn't hurt, nothing was stolen, and there was no real evidence. Just footprints and a terrible feeling. I don't know what was out there that night. Maybe it was a person, some drifter living off the land. Maybe it was something else, something I don't want to understand. I still go camping, but never alone. Never again. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. Camping alone had always been something I wanted to do. Not because I was trying to prove anything to anyone, but because I wanted to know I could do it. I had spent years camping with family and friends, but there was always something about being completely alone in the woods that fascinated me. No distractions, no noise from other people, just me, nature, and the quiet. I wanted to experience it, to know that I could handle it. I picked a spot deep in the Hoosier National Forest. I had researched the area thoroughly, made sure it wasn't too close to popular trails, and checked the weather to make sure I wouldn't be caught in a storm. Everything was planned perfectly. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a first aid kit, and my knife just in case. I wasn't worried about animals. Indiana wasn't exactly known for dangerous wildlife. My only real concern was getting lost, but I had my GPS and a physical map, so I wasn't too worried about that either. The drive out was uneventful. I parked my car at the trailhead, hoisted my pack onto my shoulders, and started the hike in. The air was crisp, the smell of damp earth and pine filling my nose. It felt good to be out there, away from the noise of the city. The first few miles were easy, just a gradual incline through the trees. The only sounds were my own footsteps and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I didn't see another person the entire time. It was exactly what I wanted. I hiked for about 3 hours before I found the perfect spot. A small clearing near a stream, surrounded by thick trees. It was flat, dry, and had plenty of space for my tent and a fire pit. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent and gathering enough wood to last the night. By the time the sun started to dip behind the trees, I had a fire going and a meal cooking. It was peaceful, exactly what I had imagined. But as the sky darkened, I started to feel different. It wasn't fear, not exactly. More like unease, like the air had changed somehow. The quiet that had been so comforting earlier now felt oppressive. The trees seemed taller, the shadows deeper. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Being alone in the woods at night was a new experience, and it made sense that I'd feel a little uneasy. I forced myself to relax, poked at the fire, and focused on the warmth against my skin. Then I heard it, a branch snapping somewhere in the darkness. Not close, but not far either. I froze, listening. My first thought was an animal, a deer maybe, but something about the sound felt off. It wasn't the quick, light snap of a deer moving through the woods. It was slower, more deliberate, like someone had stepped on it. I turned off my flashlight and let my eyes adjust to the dark. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the trees. I strained my ears, trying to catch any other sounds. For a while, there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the distant chirping of crickets. I shook my head, telling myself I was being paranoid. But then it happened again. Another snap, closer this time. I grabbed my knife and stood up slowly, scanning the treeline. My heart pounded against my ribs, every muscle in my body tense. I still couldn't see anything. I told myself it was an animal, but deep down, I didn't believe it. The next hour was pure torture. I sat by the fire, barely moving, barely breathing, listening. Every little sound made my pulse jump. I kept my knife in my hand, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but nothing happened. Eventually, the logical part of my brain won out. If it was a person, they would have made their presence known by now. If it was an animal, it would have wandered off. I forced myself to lie down in the tent, but I didn't sleep. Every little rustle, every shift of the wind, sent a fresh wave of paranoia through me. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to a strange sound. It wasn't loud, just a soft shuffling outside my tent. My body went rigid. My first thought was a raccoon sniffing around my camp, but something about it felt wrong. The sound wasn't random. It was steady, slow. I held my breath and listened. The shuffling stopped. Then, after a long pause, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A quiet, deliberate exhale, just outside the tent. I sat up slowly, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. My knife was still in my hand, clutched so tightly my fingers ached. I reached for my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on yet. I wanted to wait, to listen. Then, without warning, something pressed against the side of my tent. It wasn't hard, just the lightest pressure, like fingertips brushing against the fabric. My whole body locked up. My mind was screaming at me to do something, to run, to fight, but I couldn't move. I just sat there, gripping my knife, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the pressure disappeared. The shuffling moved away, slow and deliberate, fading into the trees. I waited, heart pounding, until I was sure it was gone. Then I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and stepped out, my flashlight and knife at the ready. The fire had burned down to embers, casting only the faintest glow around the campsite. I scanned the trees, my light cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no signs of movement. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire with my knife in my lap, watching the trees, listening. As soon as the sun started to rise, I packed up my camp. My hands were shaking as I stuffed my gear into my pack. I didn't even eat, I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back felt twice as long as before. Every sound made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me. I made it back to my car just as the sun fully rose. I threw my pack into the back seat and got inside, locking the doors before I even started the engine. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced back at the trailhead. The woods looked peaceful, just like they had the day before. But I knew better now. I don't know who or what was out there with me that night. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was some harmless camper passing through. But I don't think so. I haven't been camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe it's just to get it out of my head, or maybe it's because I need someone to believe me. I don't even know if I believe myself, but I know what happened, and I know I'm not going back to that place again. It started as a simple camping trip. Nothing special, nothing out of the ordinary. Just me, a weekend off work, and a deep itch to get away from everything. I wanted some peace, some quiet, just me and the woods. I picked a spot I had read about online, a small, relatively unknown clearing about 15 miles into the national forest. It wasn't an official campsite, just a place some hikers had mentioned as a great spot to set up a tent. The appeal was obvious: secluded, quiet, and untouched by crowds. That's exactly what I wanted. I left early in the morning, beating the heat and the traffic. The drive was uneventful, just miles of road cutting through dense tree lines. I stopped at a gas station near the edge of the forest to fill up my truck and buy some last-minute supplies: water, jerky, a couple of protein bars. The old guy behind the counter barely looked at me as he rang me up, which was fine by me. I wasn't in the mood for small talk. The trail to the clearing wasn't marked on any maps. I had to follow GPS coordinates I had written down and cross-reference with a topographical map I brought along. The first 5 miles were on a dirt road, rough but manageable. Then the road ended and it was all on foot from there. I parked my truck, grabbed my pack, and set off into the trees. The hike was harder than I expected. The trail was barely a trail, just an overgrown path with more animal tracks than footprints. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No distant hum of cars, no voices, nothing but the crunch of my boots and the occasional rustling of leaves when the wind picked up. It was peaceful, but in a way that made me uneasy. I told myself it was just the silence playing tricks on me. I wasn't used to this kind of quiet. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was starting to dip. The place was just as described. A flat, open space surrounded by tall trees, with a small stream running through one side. It was perfect. I dropped my pack, stretched out my sore shoulders, and got to work setting up camp. Tent up, firewood gathered, everything in its place. I sat by the fire, ate some jerky, and watched the sky darken. The stars came out one by one, and for a while, I felt the peace I had been looking for. Just me and nature. Then I heard it. A single, sharp snap of a branch from somewhere behind me. Not the sound of a squirrel or a bird, something bigger. I turned, scanning the darkness beyond the fire's glow. Nothing, just trees and shadows. Probably a deer, I muttered to myself. Still, I felt on edge. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing to see, just the quiet woods. I told myself I was being paranoid, shook it off, and went back to the fire. The night dragged on, and eventually, I crawled into my tent. The fire was low, but still burning, casting flickering light through the thin fabric. I lay there listening, The forest was silent again, and after a while, my eyes grew heavy. I let myself drift off. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up, but something had changed. The fire had gone out completely, leaving my tent in absolute darkness. And the silence wasn't the same anymore. It was heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, just outside the tent, I heard breathing. Not the soft exhale of wind through trees. Not the distant call of an animal. This was close, deep, slow, human. Every hair on my body stood up. My mind raced. I hadn't seen a single person all day. There was no one out here. No one but me. I held my breath, listening. The breathing was steady, unhurried. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't trying to be quiet. They wanted me to hear them. I reached slowly for the knife I kept in my pack, careful not to make a sound. My fingers wrapped around the handle, gripping it so tight my knuckles ached. My heart pounded in my ears, so loud I thought it might give me away. Then the breathing stopped. A long silence stretched out between me and whatever was outside. Then, without warning, something pressed against the side of my tent. Not a hand, not a foot, full body. The fabric caved inward as if someone was leaning their entire weight against it. I could see the shape of them, tall, broad-shouldered, unmoving. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared, gripping my knife, waiting. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the pressure lifted. The weight was gone. I stayed frozen, listening. Nothing, just silence. Minutes passed, then an hour. I didn't move until the first light of dawn started creeping through the trees. Only then did I dare unzip the tent and peek outside. There were footprints, big ones, leading from the trees straight to my tent and then away again, vanishing into the woods. I packed up in record time, shoving everything into my pack without bothering to fold it properly. I didn't eat, didn't drink. I just hiked, fast. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. Not until I saw my truck waiting where I left it. I jumped in, locked the doors, and didn't look back. I don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe some lunatic living off the grid. Maybe just some asshole trying to scare me. Or maybe something worse. All I know is that I won't be going back. Ever. The air was thick with humidity as I drove down the narrow, winding road toward the campsite. The trees leaned in on either side of the pavement, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. It was late in the afternoon, and the sun hung low, casting a golden glow over the treetops. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A chance to escape the noise of the city, to be alone with my thoughts, to clear my head. I pulled into the small clearing where I'd be spending the next 2 nights. It wasn't an official campground, just a spot I had found on an old map, far from the usual tourist traps. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs after the long drive. The silence was almost overwhelming. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no music, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the chirping of unseen birds. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, close to the tree line. The ground was uneven, but I managed to find a relatively flat spot. I unrolled my sleeping bag inside, set up a small fire pit, and gathered enough wood to last through the night. By the time I was finished, the sky had turned a deep shade of blue, and the first stars had begun to appear. As I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal of canned beans and jerky, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place, the way the trees seemed too close together, the way the silence seemed almost unnatural. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I decided to walk around the perimeter of the clearing before turning in for the night. The ground was soft under my boots, damp from recent rain. The trees stood tall and still, their trunks covered in thick moss. As I moved deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. No animal sounds, no rustling in the underbrush. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. Then I saw them. Deep in the trees, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, were boot prints. Fresh ones. They weren't mine. I had only just arrived, and I hadn't walked this far yet. The tracks led deeper into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. My stomach twisted. Someone had been here recently. Maybe they were still here. I turned and walked quickly back to my campsite, trying to keep my breathing steady. The fire was still burning, casting flickering shadows across the trees. I sat down on the log I had dragged over earlier, staring into the flames, listening. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe another camper had passed through earlier in the day. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The night dragged on. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind through the trees set my nerves on edge. I forced myself to stay awake for as long as I could, but exhaustion eventually took over. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and lay there in the darkness, listening. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. I held my breath. Then, another snap. Closer this time. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving through the underbrush just beyond the clearing. I reached for the knife I had packed, my fingers tightening around the handle. The footsteps stopped. I strained my ears, waiting, listening. Then, nothing. Just silence. I lay there for what felt like hours, every muscle in my body tense. Eventually, exhaustion won out again, and I drifted into a restless sleep. Morning came with the first light filtering through the trees. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, stretching my stiff limbs. The fire had burned down to embers. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. Then I saw them. More footprints, fresh ones. They led from the edge of the clearing to my tent, circling it once before disappearing back into the woods. I felt sick. Someone had been watching me. Someone had stood just outside my tent while I slept, close enough to hear me breathing. My heart pounded in my chest. I needed to leave. Now, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. Every sound in the woods felt amplified. Every shadow seemed to move. I loaded everything into my car, taking one last look around the campsite before climbing into the driver's seat. Then I saw it. Pinned to the tree nearest to where I had slept was a small scrap of paper. I hesitated before walking over to it, my pulse hammering in my ears. The paper was old and yellowed, the edges frayed. Scrawled across it in uneven handwriting were the words, "You shouldn't be here." I felt my stomach drop. I grabbed the note and ran back to my car, slamming the door shut, locking it. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, the sound of it roaring to life breaking the eerie silence of the forest. I didn't look back as I drove away, the trees blurring past me. The road twisted and turned, leading me away from whatever had been out there last night. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road, civilization in sight. I never went back to that place. I never told anyone about what happened. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those footprints circling my tent. I think about the note, and I wonder who was out there in the woods with me that night, and what would have happened if I hadn't left. I don't know why I agreed to the trip in the first place. Maybe it was the way the others talked about the place. Deep in the woods, miles from anything, where the air was thick with pine and the nights stretched on forever. Maybe I just wanted to get away from the noise of everyday life. But if I had known what was coming, I never would have gone. We set up camp in a clearing, a good 3-hour hike from the nearest road. The trees were dense, towering overhead, blocking out most of the late afternoon sun. It was beautiful in a way, peaceful, the kind of place that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. The first night was uneventful. We sat around the fire, ate, and talked until the flames burned low. The woods were quiet except for the usual sounds: crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a branch. Normal things that didn't seem out of place. It was sometime in the middle of the night when I woke up. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the air was still. Then I thought maybe it was an animal, but the sound wasn't quite right. It was faint, distant, something like a dull tapping or knocking. Slow, rhythmic. I listened for a long time, my heart pounding, but it never got closer. Eventually, I convinced myself I was imagining it and went back to sleep. The next day, we spent most of our time exploring. There were no trails out here, nothing but thick forest and endless trees. The air smelled of earth and damp leaves, and the sun barely reached the forest floor. We found a small stream and followed it for a while, filling our bottles with cold, clear water. At some point, I felt it again, that strange, creeping feeling, like being watched. I told myself it was just nerves, that being so far from civilization was playing tricks on me. But every time I glanced over my shoulder, the trees stood silent and still. That night, the sound came back, louder this time, closer. It was the same slow, deliberate tapping, like someone knocking on wood. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else, but the woods were dead silent. No insects, no rustling leaves, just that sound. I wasn't the only one who heard it. In the morning, one of the others mentioned it, laughing it off as some animal. But I could see the unease in his eyes. We all felt it. The silence, the way the air seemed heavier, the way the trees felt closer. We should have left then. We should have packed up and walked out while we still could. But we didn't. That day, we found something we shouldn't have. It was deep in the woods, miles from our camp. A structure, if you could call it that. Old wood, weathered and gray, sticking out of the ground in uneven patterns. Not a cabin, not a shelter, just something. Pieces of wood, bound together in strange ways, forming no real shape. There were bones, too, small ones, scattered at the base of the structure, half buried in the dirt. Some were picked clean, others still had scraps of dried flesh clinging to them. None of us spoke. We just stood there, staring until someone said we should go back. We didn't argue. That night, the knocking started again. Closer, louder, and then something else. A sound deep in the woods. A low, dragging noise. Slow, uneven. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The others heard it, too. I could tell by the way the air in the camp felt different. Tense, waiting. Then it stopped. Everything stopped. The knocking, the dragging. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And then, just outside my tent, a footstep. I have never been so terrified in my life. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. Just lay there, listening. Another footstep. Then another. Slow, careful, right outside. Something brushed against the fabric of the tent. I bit my tongue to keep from screaming. Then silence. I don't know how long I lay there, waiting. Eventually, morning came. When I finally crawled out of my tent, the others were already awake, pale-faced and silent. No one said a word as we packed up our gear. No one looked at each other. We left as fast as we could, barely stopping for water. The whole way back, I felt it, that presence, that feeling of being watched. When we finally reached the road, I turned back one last time. The woods were still, empty, but I knew, deep down, we were never alone out there. I never went camping again.